And apparently, it's been a while, so my mic was off. So let's start again. Good afternoon, and welcome to Wired's live living room sessions, special edition, truly a special edition. You may be familiar with our sessions as during the months of April to July, Walker's Institute for Regenerative Research, Education and Design, WIRRED, and CPRI, the Caribbean Permaculture Research Institute, partnered to bring you live living room sessions twice weekly. In the ensuing 25 episodes, we engage local and international experts sharing their insights on the topics of climate change, building biodiversity, renewable energy, and regenerative agriculture. Today's special edition is the second of a special set of live living room sessions that we will be hosting to mark special events and days of recognition which align with our core areas, our organizational values, and our mandates. The first of the special edition series was done by CPRI's Jen Ward Clark, and she explored World Youth Skills Day with agriculturalists Christina Pula and Shaquille Watkins. Together, they looked at youth and skills through the lens of two homegrown youth who forged careers in agriculture and environmental fields through skills development locally. If you haven't already, I encourage you to watch this session and any of the other 25 hosted to date. All episodes are available on Wired's YouTube channel, and if you missed it, remember it's as easy as click, subscribe, and watch. If you're joining us for the first time, my name is Kiesha Farnum from Walker's Institute for Regenerative Research, Education and Design, WIRRED. And today's episode is focused on World Tourism Day, which was actually yesterday. And we will be sharing the unique insights of A. Christopher Lee of PCSR Consulting, Inc. Chris, as he's affectionately called, is a speaker, trainer, and tourism customer service professional with over 10 years of experience in tourism and the hospitality industry. Chris has spent formative years working with the international Hilton hotel chain, completing a number of stints in North America and the Caribbean, culminating his last few years in Beijing, China, where he has completed a master's in tourism management, gaining valuable experience in the local training and tourism planning industry in China. Chris brings a fresh perspective to the arena, having worked on a number of tourism-related and development initiatives that focus on the Sino-Caribbean relationship. Within the scope of the digital nomad space, international business and tourism, Chris recently has been focusing on promoting training and research efforts on cross-cultural communication and engagement. Chris, it is indeed a pleasure to have you with us here today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here as well, Kiesha. How are you doing today?
I am good. Apparently, it's been a while since I've done a living room session and that I forgot to turn on my mic.
That's okay. It happens to the best of us.
So we're off to an auspicious start for sure.
Sounds good.
But we have such an interesting discussion planned today. So I think let's just jump straight into the discussion. And we've had several discussions, particularly in light of World Tourism Day, but also because it's such a critical part of our economy here in Barbados and in the rest of the Eastern Caribbean. We need to talk about tourism. We need to talk about reimagining tourism, rethinking tourism, reframing tourism. And it's definitely not a business as usual framework. We cannot go back to business as usual. And so I guess the question that most persons are addressing is, why is imagining tourism and its relationship with the host or local community so crucial?
Well, let me start by just saying, as you said, it cannot reiterating your fact. It's not business as usual. And when we look at just any industry period, it's so important for us to be constantly reevaluating, relooking, and especially in these times, trying to reinvent our models as it stands today. Now, with regards to the host and local community, I think one of the traditional narratives that we would have had globally, but especially in the Caribbean, is that tourism is a perfectly packaged product for visitors to come and experience, and then they interact with local people. And by definition of local, it's just meaning people that live or grow up here. And so I think that we need to really look at that host visitor relationship first and foremost, and understanding how it can be evolved. And secondly, because of the fact that with COVID as well, we've had to close our borders and we don't have as many foreign visitors, what type of additional role the community has to play, not in just taking up of a lot of the different tourist sites and products, but as well as building that culture and building that product and service as well.
Definitely. I mean, COVID-19 has definitely left us with closed borders. We have reopened our borders in a very discreet way. But it has stopped, mass international arrivals. And then, of course, the economic damage is substantial. When we look at unemployment, when we look at the fact that many businesses have had to close down or close temporarily, and then we look at, yes, there's been a rise, and I think that's probably like the silver lining. There has been a rise in domestic tourism, which has forced a lot of operators to shift focus and kind of look at their offerings, and see how they can engage the local tourists, right? So staycations and etc. are on the rise, but that's not enough at this point to sustain the tourism industry. Not when it is such a vital economic driver within Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean. So there needs to be a shift to not only just looking at locals, which is very, very important, but maybe a shift to slower travel. Travel that brings major benefits on reducing the carbon footprint of tourism. I think the government of Barbados has done a fantastic job in starting in that direction with the welcome stamp that they have introduced to Barbados.
Yes.
But there is still so much more to be done. So a step definitely is being taken. Steps are being taken in the right direction within the confines of the space that we are now operating. But as we will discuss further in our conversation, there is room for improvement. There is room for change, right?
Right. And if I can just comment to what you were saying too, in that shift, it's also in looking at the fact that the tourism industry is not an industry in its isolation, because besides just tourism workers, hotels, we also have tourism related businesses, the food and beverage industry, and other suppliers and farmers and so forth that would have been attached to that also have that part to play. So it's about seeing it outside of isolation, seeing the interconnected nature that this industry has with other industries,
Yeah, exactly. And then in just kind of segueing into the whole idea of regenerative tourism, I think when we talk about regenerative tourism, most persons, they've heard us talk about regenerative agriculture.
Correct.
And just like regenerative agriculture, there are several aspects of regenerative agriculture. Most persons, when they hear us talk about regenerative tourism, they're thinking about things like responsible tourism, which is a paradigm that exists now, ethical tourism, sustainable tourism. And you hear persons use those terms. I mean, in fact, the whole concept of sustainable tourism is linked to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, right? And it ultimately, those goals are us operating in a way that does not compromise the opportunities for future generations. So that tourism that isn't compromising the opportunities for future generations. And in practice, what we see a lot of is, persons making changes in terms of sustainable tourism initiatives, looking at the introduction of technology. So a good example of that is, a lot of hotels are going towards energy efficient technology, whether it's their lights, the use of energy efficient equipment in their kitchens, etc., which is all good, right? But as we will discuss here further, regenerative tourism is so much more than that.
Right. And so, and as we would have been starting to lay the groundwork in this conversation, it is, and especially on this type of platform, it's looking at that relationship between the environment and the community and how they have that interdependent relationship. And it's not good enough to just see these sustainable efforts as just a good thing to do because it's, where it looks good on paper or because, we really, it's essential, it's necessary for us to for our community to protect our environment. And because effectively the environment is what is helping us bring those opportunities, especially in an area like tourism, because when the guests are looking to come to a destination, especially in my work and being in the hospitality industry, the two key things that they always talk about is first, our environment with sea, sand, and sun in Barbados' case. And then the second is our people. So how do we engage with in these two different areas and help to develop that relationship further? And I think that's really would be something interesting to discuss further in this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, regenerative tourism is very much looking at tourism as an ecosystem. So you're looking at
Correct.
your natural, which is the environment that you just addressed, your
Hmm.
social,
Social.
and your cultural elements, and how all of those interact. So it's taking a holistic approach to understanding and developing tourism products and looking at, okay, what are the consequences, whether they're intended or unintended, on the social impact, on the natural environment, on the cultural elements
Cultural.
of the society or the host community, as you refer to it, and
Correct.
realizing that everything is connected, right? And so that it's a loop. And how do you now make sure that the well-being and the health of the system is intact, the health of the land, the health of the people? And this can happen in multiple ways, right? So for example, the tourism, if a tourism business supports a social enterprise or social cause, then you're looking at tourism supporting or making some type of contribution towards that thriving environment, community, and culture.
Correct. And in a meaningful and long-term way, because the same way, and I guess to draw the tangent to the work travel stamp, whereby the initial initiative was to get people to stay here longer, and that also by extension reduces carbon footprint. But another part of tourism, and then also looking at our relationship with the environment, is how we can have things last, how we can form deeper connections, how we can keep things sustained, you know? And I think that is definitely, in terms of not just the conversation we're having now, but the one that the powers that be and the leaders need to continually look at in the narrative. It's not a foreign, just tourism as a foreign entity, again, as I would have said, the visitor coming to just visit us for a short period of time and that's it. We want to start really forming more long-term, lasting, sustainable initiatives and relationships
But
with all
Chris,
stakeholders. Mhm.
exactly. And Chris, I know that you have been working on that whole Sino-Caribbean relationship, and then looking at the Chinese experience with tourism. And in looking at that experience, what do you think are some of the learnings that you've come up with, and some of the things that might be able to be translated in this context in terms of the use of culture um, as a driving force for tourism?
Well, I think that the first and foremost thing is to take some of their systems of planning and execution. If anybody knows China well or can see how they've done, even with managing this whole COVID experience, they plan things out to a T. They look at all the details and they look at the interconnected nature of things. And when it comes to tourism and the environment, my time in China, and having worked with a tourism planning company, you see things down to what type of plants they want to put there so that it can be good, not just for aesthetic purposes, but for so that people can maybe reap for food purposes, and also how it will help to keep the soil intact, etc. So all of that plays a big part into how they do it. And then going into the culture, the community aspect. Now I know that there are different stories and narratives and pros. People will criticize how China has been so strong-handed in the management of its people, but I think that is still very necessary in any type of society where there needs to be a direction and there needs to be a very consistent message where it's saying this is what we need to do and this is how we need to be organized, because in the larger picture of things, when it looks at the strategy and the long term, this is what's going to help us reap the best benefits and results.
Yeah. So you're looking at tourism development that is focused on the human, the social, the economic system, and that is pointed towards a destination so that everybody's on board with the plan. Everybody's going in the same direction. And I
Correct.
think,
And then some,
mhm.
sorry to interrupt. And then
No,
another
it's
thing
okay.
I guess that lies hand in hand with is that tourism is now becoming a point of focus in China more and more. But previous to that, they were China's one place that they're very big on things like food security and needing to plant certain crops to feed the 1.4 billion people. And so what is interesting when they use something like the agricultural industry or growing crops with tourism is you'll see many cities that were designated for growing a specific crop, then using tourism as kind of like a spill off where they'll say, okay, now you can come and visit our strawberry fields or our rice fields and so forth. So I think it's all, for me personally, I've also seen that where I think while tourism is our main industry and we coin it as such, I think it's important to look at also how do we build up these other industries first, because they are kind of more of the backbone initially, and then using tourism to then get some benefits from having people come to visit and that foreign revenue gain from visitors as well.
Yeah, one of the things that I found quite interesting when I was reading up about this topic is looking at that whole collaborative action learning system of training for tourism and education for tourism, so that we're getting a little bit of feedback there. I apologize, not sure why. But yeah, that whole collaborative action learning feedback program of education that creates a conscious host, because it's not only just about the tourists of themselves being conscious. And we do see that, some countries, the tourists are far more conscious than others. We think about some of the European countries like Germany, etc. They're very much focused on the environment, paying respect to the persons of the locals of the host country, wanting to experience ecotourism, wanting to have a cultural experience. And so, yes, there is education of the tourists, but there's also education of the host or the locals that need to take place. Because if they're not on the same page, then they're not going to understand why certain products, etc., are being offered, right?
Correct.
When
Correct.
you exactly so when you look at how we then nurture and support local communities to develop sustainable and regenerative tourism products, what are your thoughts on how we go about that process?
Well, as I would have said before, I think tourism is one industry, but it is so interconnected with a lot of our other industries, agriculture, business, and so forth. And so, in looking at how to engage with locals, it's by starting at the very beginning of getting them involved in the planning process. Because another aspect in my research as well that I would have done is once you get the community involved from the very beginning, informing the product and not just understanding here's this product and this is what we're going to teach you about it, but getting their input as to how they can get a certain level of ownership and stakehold in it, then they by extension are going to feel more responsible for taking care of the environment, for example, and taking care of their cultural capital. And they also, as a result, get a better understanding of what they have to offer and what they're bringing to the table. And that's always good for any type of relationship you're trying to build that is sustainable and long term.
Yeah. So for me, if I'm looking and I'm thinking about, okay, what would a thriving tourism sector look like that takes into consideration a regenerative approach? You would be looking at strengthening the social fabric of activities in rural environments, the diversification of incomes. So you might have farm stays, you might have glamping, you might have food trails, farmers markets. So how do you integrate the local economies? Restored environments. So, for example, like what Walker's Reserve is doing and the work that's being done at Cocoa Hill Forest.
Correct.
When you look at what that strategy looks like, that strategy looks at a very engaged local environment. And what that does, interestingly enough, is that it forms an emotional attachment to places in the minds of the tourists. They now have a memorable experience because they've spoken to a local who gave them a truly authentic experience, which they remember far more than a cookie cutter type experience.
Hmm.
And then they're more likely to come back.
Well,
They're more like,
Well, what's
Yeah.
good about that, and especially given the fact that right now we're dealing with a lot of, as you said, our community, is I see a lot of these same, such as walkers, even some of the smaller. I have a friend who does fish farming for tilapia, and they have these school tours, and they try and that's another way of also connecting some members of the community with these local players in the tourism sphere, agriculture, tourism, etc. So it's about doing our job and creating that platform for both, like you said, the visitor, someone that doesn't live here, wasn't born here, as well as those people that live and or were born here.
And I mean, to be fair, I think that there are a lot of Barbadians and Caribbean people in general who have not had the experience to experience their own island. There are things that tourists are able to come and do that locals haven't thought about doing. One, or they feel like it's not for them, it's not
Correct.
accessible for them,
And we
and
have to
so
ask why. We have to
yeah,
ask why is that the case?
yeah, and why is that the case?
Right. So, and I specifically brought it up as that question
Yeah,
for us to discuss, and it goes back to exactly what we said. We're talking about reimagining tourism. So then
yeah,
within that, we have to really look at what is this narrative that we keep saying to people about tourism, and it is again looking at tourism as a foreign entity or product for the consumption of somebody else outside. And now if effectively we have to get them to stop thinking, oh well, it's only because we can't get tourists that we want you to come and support. It's only you need to know about this product
yeah,
so you can tell the tourists. So then effectively you're creating a disconnect and a strange relationship with the community, with its own community, and
yeah,
so
yeah,
we're talking about regenerative, and we're looking at sustainability. I mean, it's not sustainable to try and make someone look at it and only want to support an initiative or a program or a focus when it's looking at benefiting somebody else, because
yeah,
effectively the narrative is it benefits you as well because you are a part of this ecosystem.
yeah. I think one of the it makes people care, and I don't think I could find a simpler way of saying that. But if it is that you understand the beauty, the experience, the cultural implications, the environmental implications behind activities that you're engaged in as a local, um, you are more likely then to to be an advocate for that because you understand what's happening and you feel connected to it. Whereas if you're just providing something for somebody, there is of course a level of service that you're inclined to provide, but this it's almost this kind of detached um, element to it where you're not you're not 100% invested because you don't really understand the why of what you're doing, or the how, or how it impacts, whether negatively or not, the experience that's taking place. And so having that invested um, element, not only from locals who are involved in the tourism sector, but also from everybody, from
The
the
wider
entire,
community,
exactly, the
yeah.
wider community. you know um, it's one of those things, is like everybody then plays a role. So even if you don't have a tourism related business, you're still able to provide information, talk about Barbados, talk about the culture to somebody that you might come across, provide advice, just be polite, right? And so it really does have spill on effects. I do, looking at the cultural aspect is one element. But again, with the regenerative approach, it is always okay. What are the other elements? So when you look at infrastructure is another element. And
Correct.
how does the infrastructure that we put in place support regenerative tourism? So we talked earlier about the energy efficient investment, right?
Yes.
And that is in roads, lighting, sanitation, waste management, other public services, just to name a few, that not only reduces the carbon footprint of the nation, but also provides jobs, right, in the implementation of these energy efficient, renewable energy alternatives to infrastructure.
Hmm.
And in the long run, provides a regenerative, one element of a regenerative tourism product. You're
Right.
looking at creating meaningful platforms for feedback. And I know you have some thoughts on that in terms of how people can be engaged, in terms of meaningful platform. It's not just having a town hall meeting where people get to talk, but then there's no follow-up action. The ideas of the community haven't actually been put into play. It's just this perfunctory tick on a project management, thing that we've, consulted the community. And then, of course, there is the legal framework. And so when you
Mhm.
look at the legal framework, you need to have that enforcement. And I know in your China experience, you've seen that in the legal framework of things, and how, if it is that you're going to move a country in a certain direction, you need to have the enforcement. You need to have a solid legal framework.
But as we know, there are all different components to it, as you said. And the thing about where using China as example is that whether they make a mistake or not, or it's not a perfect system, it's intentional. And so when we're talking about working with communities, when we're talking about a regenerative approach, it's about, like you said, intention, and intention not just on just by talking and having town halls, as you said, but actually creating action plans, very smart goals, and saying this needs to be done. And the truth is, as you would have mentioned, we are only now in the last decade or so really getting on board on looking at things as the light, and using sustainable environment approaches. But when it comes to people and changing mindset, that takes a lot longer. And so if you don't make a start from now, then how can we really foresee or project to have some sort of shift in this thought process if we don't start putting things in place, like real tangible actionable initiatives, and then following that up, like you said, through with legal implications. And it has to happen at all levels in the society, because I think another narrative that too often happens, especially in Barbados, I think, is that we kind of wait on the government to initiate. And while the government is an important player, it also takes the involvement of private sector, and just like you said, the person's right directly in the community to feel like they have a voice and can see something and make something happen. I think COVID has probably, going back to working with the community in a regenerative approach and building a more sustainable relationship, I think what's been good is that now you see people actually putting words to action. They're not no longer saying, oh, well, what am I going to do? I'm just going to wait on the tourists to come in so I can make money, or I have to wait on somebody to hire me. They're like, no, I can hustle now, and I can try and figure out and make this product and make it its own. And that all will help in this process, and I think it's about how do we tap into that.
I mean, you're so right. I mean, the legal framework, it's not only just to protect the special places, protect cultural elements that the tourists are experiencing, but it also makes the priority of the government, of the authorities, quite clear. And then this gives communities confidence for longer term planning. And that segues really nicely into the whole idea of training and support, and
Mhm.
looking at why is it important for us to focus on teaching the tools of cross-cultural communication engagement as a means of developing the tourism workforce with a global mindset?
Right. So I guess I want to kind of segue, utilize a previous situation whereby, although right now we're in a current situation where borders are closed and we don't have access to a lot of visitors or foreign persons, investments, etc., the reality is we still need that. And it's for trade, tourism, for industry, period. And so in trying to reimagine and reshape, we also need to look at new markets. And so that new markets and new communities outside also, it helps to understand the cultural context of what it is that they want, what is it that need. Using this prime example of digital nomads. Now, I think a lot of people, we hear the buzzword digital nomads. Okay, great. It's someone that can just afford to work anywhere remotely and they are very tech oriented. But do we really understand what they need? And then furthermore, are we training and teaching the people how to engage with them effectively, how to form those productive relationships, both on a social level as well as a professional level? And so that's why part of the work that I do is originally initiated from trying to train a lot of Chinese counterparts in engaging in the international market for tourism, but it went deeper because it was about understanding that cultural context. And by understanding cultural context, you can create a blueprint how to more effectively engage with these potential new markets that you want to have come in, whether it be for trade, business, or tourism purposes.
Yeah. When I digital, the digital nomad concept and what that brings and what that can bring to the tourism market for Barbados is one element of it. But when you talk about a global mindset, if you could just elaborate on that, what you mean by a global mindset?
So within a lot of cross-cultural and cultural understanding and cooperation, it's about finding that balance that we're yes, we are all people and we have a lot of similarities as people who have certain basic needs, but then at the same time we have certain differences, and quite often not people are afraid of engaging and understanding and acknowledging those differences. So when we look at a global mindset, especially as a small island developing economy, we will constantly always have to be looking outward as well as inward. We will constantly have to be engaging with all types of people, and it's about trying to understand that we can find the similarities but also celebrate the differences. And I think that's a big part of that whole cross-cultural component.
Yeah. Well, if you're just joining us, I'm seeing persons joining us online as we speak. We are speaking to cross cultural communication and engagement tourism expert, A. Christopher Lee, about reimagining tourism in Barbados and the wider Caribbean. And Chris, as we start looking before we go into questions from the audience, I think my last question to you would be, how can locals become protectors of the environment? I'm just kind of looking at that before we jump into questions from the audience.
No, that's quite all right. I think that again, it goes right back down to that multi-approach, multi-layered strategy where we need to really explain and develop that relationship that the community has with the environment, to understand the interdependence of it all, that it's not just something good and as a Samaritan kind of goodwill effort. So, and then in addition to that, if we have to be very practical and specific about it, it's about getting them to see that relationship and engage with these people and the environment directly. So there's the educational side of it, but then once you start, I know one initiative that I see some people do where young kids go and farm from the land as an exercise, and there's some cool schools that do that. Just that simple act alone helps them to understand, wow, this is something, a benefit I derive from the earth, and so as a result, it helps to have the wheels turning in their head. Oh, so I get something from the earth, and so as a result, I should give back. And I know it sounds a bit airy-fairy in that regard, but it's those type of programs and initiatives that actually help to, again, develop that organic relationship that we have together, the community and the environment.
Yeah, it doesn't sound airy fairy at all. I mean, there are, we at Wired, we're doing that CPRI. It's one of it's also their mandate with Permablitz. I know that there are other players like Peg Farm and Cocoa Hill Forest where, as part of the activity, people are actually engaging in tree planting, engaging with the earth, um, and are super excited to do it. Not only at the school level or at the youth level, but you have
Mm-hmm.
tourists who want to come and volunteer as part of their vacation. They want to come and volunteer. They want to plant trees. They want to offset their carbon footprint for the travel that they've just made. I mean, and when you look at at what needs to happen, you look at how you're empowering communities to make decisions. So you're providing them with the know-how, you're providing them with sound information, and that information has to be across industry networks.
Correct.
So exactly what you said in terms of food security, energy efficiency, all of those things, they work in tandem together. So it's not just one. And as local hosts or the local host community, they need to understand all the different moving parts in order to know how to effectively engage. And then you look at not just a top down approach. So it's not just
Bottom up.
exactly. It's not just government. Government certainly has a role to play. Don't get me wrong. Particularly with the legal framework, with infrastructure and those kinds of things.
And help
But
setting a vision as well.
yes, yes, helps set in a vision and making sure that everybody's on board with that vision, right? And
Mm-hmm.
everybody
Correct.
understands the trajectory of that vision and that
And that's
the
not
actions
always
are follow.
easy. Sorry,
No.
and that's not always. I mean, I don't want our viewers here in here in this conversation to think that we just think, okay, we're just going to. It's so easy. We just do up this action plan framework and you execute, and that's not how life
Yeah.
works. That's not how business works. I mean, that's why we're in the situation we're in. We would have had a previous model, and because of COVID, we'd have to really reshape and rethink and reimagine this. And especially when you take it in consideration of a regenerative approach, I think it really ties into the fact of, okay, in trying to create a new approach, how do we really make it long lasting and sustainable for all stakeholders, and especially considering the community and the environment together, you know?
Yeah. And I think it's a iterative process as well, because as people start to see that they can generate income, that their communities are thriving, and this they see that, they're protecting the fragile ecosystems, they are, treasuring the cultural elements of the tourism experience. They're seeing that
Mm-hmm.
infrastructure is being improved,
Mm-hmm.
and they're seeing all the different things coming together, that it's an iterative process. So people become more and more involved. They realize, okay, this is benefiting me, right?
Right.
And you can keep that going.
Right, and how more that they put effort into it, the more that they then can reap the results, you know. And
Yeah.
then just lastly, as it pertains, going back to the cultural component, that is then you see that evolution of the culture, and by extension, that is the culture then that will then pass off to people that are now coming in to see it for the first time, or who are understanding where Barbados was before and where it is going, and seeing that type of synergy that's happening. And so I think it's something that, again, it's a really great approach that needs to be looked at further.
Right. Well, Chris, let's go into questions from the audience.
Sure.
Right. Let's go into questions from the audience, and let's see what our first question is. Our first question is from Micah. Hi, Micah, and she's on our YouTube channel. What role can the digital nomad play in the regenerative tourism model? I know we started to speak a bit on that, but maybe if you could elaborate more on that, particularly in light of the welcome stamp that we have now.
Right. Well, I think what is great about the way the government and in general we're pivoting towards relationships with these type of markets is that the digital nomad, as I said before, is looking for a more long-term stay person. And traditionally, somebody that is looking to stay in a space for longer has a more vested interest in the environment. And when I say the environment, I mean both the trees and the sand and the beach, but also the people. And so when we're looking at regenerative, we can really get some really good insight into these people who are not just coming for a quick visit and then going, as to maybe their suggestions and thoughts. And then through their investments as well, both monetarily and some of them, based on what I'm seeing in a lot of these different group chats, their knowledge and expertise area, we can definitely try and reel them into this process and get them to take a ownership and stakehold into it as well. Because again, I think that this type of nomad, even if it's for it's longer than the normal 1 week, 2 week person, but it's still short. But they again have a more vested interest in that.
You know,
I,
there's
I,
there's no, it's quite interesting
does that make
because
sense?
it does. On the weekend, I was having a discussion with a local blogger and
Okay.
Instagram person who represents Barbados, and
Okay.
she was actually she was saying that she was getting a lot of feedback from the digital nomad space, and them saying, "Listen, we're not backpackers. We're professionals." And I think there's a concept in people's head of what a digital nomad looks like,
Correct.
and because it's new. It's not new generally, but I think it definitely is new to the Caribbean. I know for a lot of companies across COVID, just people working outside of the office, it was a first. Having
Mm-hmm.
people work remotely from home and that kind of stuff, it wasn't even conceptualized for some people. Some companies had to put a whole framework in place just to allow people to work from home, with across the region,
Mm-hmm.
which was great. Which a lot of experts are saying is a silver lining of COVID, that it has really catapulted the Caribbean into the modern workspace, right? So a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
don't understand the concept of the digital nomad, um, and
And
it
there's two
definitely
different
warrants
concepts
more.
as well.
There you
Sorry,
go.
remember
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
there's a digital nomad, which anybody who, and I'm going to put a plug in there from my friend Dr. Rochelle Haynes, who's doing a lot of talk right now on it. You have
Yeah.
someone that just remotes from any, that is not location dependent, but then
Mm-hmm.
you have the concept of just what they call remote working, someone who just works remotely. And so and that's just because what a lot of companies are doing, period. So we need to understand that they are under a similar umbrella, but they're not the exact same thing. But in terms of trying to target anyone at the end of the day that is coming back to wanting to be in Barbados for an extended period of time, my observation, and I'm sure many other people in our viewership can agree, they are much more invested in the sustainability and welfare of this environment than the typical tourist that would just come for a few days or come for a week. And so that, in going back to the question at hand, is that because of that relationship, we can definitely utilize them, and not just, again, looking at it from a monetary perspective, because a lot of people keep thinking, oh great, they're going to come here longer and they'll spend more money, which is important.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of knowledge sharing and expertise that they bring to the table too, because these are very global people a lot of times, that have lived in all different types of communities and societies, that we can learn from them. And I think that is another aspect of our strategy, our outreach, and our engagement with this community that we can benefit from here in Barbados and by extension the Caribbean.
Yeah, I mean, and it also creates opportunities for businesses locally to be created to meet the needs of these individuals. So I know of
Correct.
one project called Suit Free, which will be coming from the 1st of November. They will have a location in the west on Whole Town. They will have a location on the south coast, and it's providing a comprehensive space for persons to be able to work, but with other amenities within that space that makes it a fun workspace
Mhm.
for individuals who are working remotely, whether on the welcome visa or locals who are working remotely and want to get out of the house and have a different space to work in. Young entrepreneurs, that sort of thing. Definitely,
Right.
it is. There is a lot of opportunity for the creation of new business models to meet the needs of this market.
Right. It's effectively how I kind of point to a lot of people. It's about we are a community in ourselves, and we are welcoming you into our community. So it's about developing that community dynamic with another community. And
Yeah.
so going back to what we would have spoken a little earlier about understanding cross culture, it can also mean the culture of digital nomads mixing with the local Barbadian culture, and
Yeah.
understanding how to synergize those two together. So there's so many different aspects which this can be looked at.
Yeah. Shifting a little bit before we go into another question, I see some statements from our friend Wiga. I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. Wiga Rufus from Aruba. Welcome. We very happy to
Hi.
have our fellow Caribbean, brothers and sisters joining us on the show. And you mentioned that the island should reward those through incentives, those travelers that seek sustainably based businesses and promote the natural environment and health of the islands. And that is definitely one of those infrastructural type and policy based type things that can happen from the government's end, in terms of reinforcing and making sure that individuals have an opportunity, and that those who are doing the right thing are encouraged to further do the right thing. I
Correct.
don't
And
know
he
if you have any
says,
thoughts on this.
well, what I was going to add to that is he says, looking at incentives to reward those travelers that seek these sustainably based businesses, but conversely, also rewarding again those businesses that are promoting it as well. So, what allowances, what tax incentives, what things that we can do. And I know that some of it has been done already, and
Yeah,
it continues to do so. But it's again trying to see how can we take it a step further.
exactly. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Ah, look, we have a question from Jen.
Hi, Jan.
Jen is on the other side of the audience now. She's not in front of the camera today.
Mhm.
And Jen is asking, is the current cruise model sustainable or regenerative?
This is always for me personally, and always such a tricky one, because at the end of the day, I would never tell. I understand within our tourism model, the cruise push is a very big one, for two reasons. One, we can say how many people have come into the island, and then yes, we do get a certain amount on the tax per head. But I definitely think that there is still if we are looking at sustainable and regenerative, I think that we have a long way to go in trying to, one, maximize and better evolve the cruise ship passenger experience when they get off that boat, and in having that physical connection with this destination, and regenerative in that and again, I might not know all the specific details, but in terms of how giving them a platform, since we are trying to, they come in numbers. So if it is that they can be a platform that they can use to help give back through helping the environment and so forth as well, whether it be through a donation fund or maybe even working again with the local businesses that are sustainable based and environmental based to engage with them more, because if we're really looking at the sustainable approach, that is where I think it needs to go. But other than that, right now as it stands, I don't particularly find it that we're making the best use of that market as we could.
Going back to our friend from Aruba, who's been making some very interesting comments in the, not questions but comments.
That's okay.
In the thing, he's saying, Rufus is saying that tourism on many of the islands are generated by package deals, discounts, and this I feel hurts the island because we get too many tourists that really leave little behind, especially the all-inclusive packages. And I know one of the questions that comes up is the all-inclusive package really inclusive? What are your thoughts on that?
Right. So again, I think this is something, especially for smaller tourism-based destinations that have less capacity to deal with large numbers. It's again moving from that concept of mass tourism to more community-based, moving from mass to more niche. And I think that while it can be economically attractive for a lot of people to say, well, let's try and get as many people as possible, the truth is that it has a severe impact on our environment, first and foremost, through its usage and a lot of the wear and tear, but then also our people. And so I definitely agree with what Wiga Rufus is saying, whereby I think we need to be very mindful and cautious of how we proceed. Not saying, again, you shouldn't have it at all, but perhaps there is another way we can shape that relationship and maybe not be so heavily focused on cruise ships, tourism and all-inclusives. Because what I also tend to find as well, and I mean, I used to grow up in Jamaica, is that the mindset sometimes of these two particular markets is that they've already paid all their money. They kind of are just, so they're not really looking to, one, spend a lot more, or two, actually come out and engage with the community and give back furthermore by extension. So if we're really going back to our whole concept of sustainability, regenerative and long term, I think there's definitely a lot of ways we need to relook at and reimagine the way that we are managing this particular market.
Yeah, exactly. Well, when we look at examples, and I think I see a question on examples and stuff that we can probably look at around the world. New Zealand has done such a fantastic job of integrating a regenerative approach to tourism. And then you look at some of the African countries and what they've done on with their national parks, etc., and how the fees that go along with those national parks not only sustain the national parks but also feed into school programs. You have the examples in Italy where there are whole tourism products that are just focused on food, and it's not going to fancy 5-star restaurants, of which there are many and they are amazing. But it's also literally doing like food tours through small villages and eating at granny's house because she's using this local recipe that was passed on from generation to generation. And you have this experience of sitting there and having that. Brazil has also done a good job in some places of like that too as well, where it's a very I actually went to one of those food experiences in Brazil where I swear the woman looked like my grandmother, one. So there was already a connection. I was like, oh my gosh, she looked like She
Granny.
didn't, exactly, she didn't speak a word of English, but she continually tried to speak to me the entire time. And I felt like we were communicating. She brought
Right.
us into her kitchen, and there were these brick ovens, etc. Nothing, very fancy, very nothing fancy, sorry, very authentic. The food was there. You pay one fee, you eat as much, and every single day the menu changes, and it's only
Hmm.
authentic Afro-Brazilian food
Right.
that she's preparing. And
Right.
every single night it was full. Like we decided that we went to one other fancy restaurant the other night, and then we decided, you know what, we're going back to Granny's for the rest of our stay. So we booked, but every single night she was full because people wanted that authentic local experience. Can you think of
And
any other examples?
well, for sure. So I'll do two things for you. One, I know for sure Costa Rica, and
Yeah,
when it comes to the environment and incorporating that in their tourism pack, incorporating tourism actually in a lot of their initiatives, whether it be through educational exchange and studying and agriculture. And
yeah,
Jamaica is a very big advocate, and I mean there's still some room for growth there as well. But they have been a big advocate for a while on community-based tourism, which is exactly the type of experience you've had. And it kind of really goes into that conversation which we said earlier about cross-cultural and global mindset, where you were able, this, you did not know this person, Granny, but you had that human connection. So there's the commonality, right?
yeah,
But then the difference is the cultural exchange and your openness and willingness to understand her culture, and for her, by an extension of welcoming you into her space, to understand and get a bit of yours. And so when it comes, going back to what we were talking about earlier about the training and cross-cultural understanding, that's a lot of what we need to and can do with our local community here. And
yeah,
then yeah, so I think it's very, very interesting. But no, we definitely going along that approach. And then also taking another tangent of, I think some of these places, I think what they look at it as is not just, again, treating tourism as an isolated industry where they just package it and say this is for someone foreign or something that I'm not connected to, but it creates that more vested interest because I'm now physically involved. I now have that physical connection. This is a part of who I am. I am a very big reason why this whole thing exists, you know? And so
yeah,
then and I need, and when we look at that community development of the culture and development and preservation of the environment, that is how you start to get a real shift in people's understanding and taking responsibility into why they need to safeguard their environment and their community and their culture.
yeah. So Mel on our Facebook page, she suggested, she said in Dominica, the Kalinago tours, teaching and experiencing the Carib experience, which I have actually done too as well, Mel, and it
Ah,
was absolutely amazing. I've also done indigenous tours in Suriname, and it was definitely an experience to remember. And these kind of stories I tell these stories when I'm
mhm,
with friends or I'm going out, and then they want to then have those experiences as well. I think one of
right.
the things too that we tend to underestimate, and this is not just Barbados, but this is throughout the Caribbean, we feel that because our experience is not Western or European based, that it's not as good as, or the things that we grew up with, because it's become so normalized for us that people wouldn't want to pay to come and experience those things. And one very simple example comes to mind for me is having foreigners visit Walker's Reserve,
Hmm.
and one of our staff taking a coconut off the tree because we're currently regenerating a sand mine into a food forest.
Right.
And so we have coconut trees, and the guy picks the coconut off the tree and chops it right there and gives them to drink. Now that is a very basic Caribbean experience for us, right?
Right.
But they were so blown away. They're like, oh my gosh, this is so great. And experiences like that where you can go pick your own food and have a chef prepare a local meal for you.
Hmm.
Those are the things that we can be looking at, that actually doesn't take a lot of infrastructure. It just takes
Hmm.
a map, a plan, a framework, and something that we can do, that we can add elements to our tourism product, and just kind of realizing that the cultural elements that we all have on all the different Caribbean islands, um, have have so much value to the community, to people outside for whom,
Well,
they're not accustomed to this sort of stuff.
and I guess what's really good, again, as much as I wouldn't say COVID is a good thing, I think a lot of people would say that it has forced us to relook at ourselves and our local market, but also by extension our regional market. I know that there are some challenges with regards to traveling from island to island, and the cost attached to that. But no, I definitely think that through these types of cultural exchanges, and in giving the same equivalent value and depth of understanding to them as we would anywhere else in the world, is also a bit of that educational process that we need to include when it comes, again, going back to building a sustainable model. Because if you also, one thing that we put, as you highlighted, we could potentially possess, is if we don't even see the value or appreciation for our own community and our own culture, how could we then even try to attempt to tell them, well, it's important for you to take care of it, because they already don't put the value that needs to be on it
Yeah.
there. And
Yeah.
that's a bit of work we need to do within ourselves. Everything from, I mean, there was a not a long time ago where people look at the farmer and say, well, that's slave work, and not realizing how essential the role is of the farmer to the community, with not just food security, but just in just general sustenance. And then
Yeah.
and then now by extension, how it has linked to our tourism industry, because the farmers then go to help the suppliers, who then sell to the hotels. So it all has a multi-layered level of interaction.
Yeah. As we were talking about, us valuing our experiences, I remember one of the sessions that we did with Dr. Sonia Peter, of
Mhm.
Heritage Teas. And I mean, she's doing so much work in biodiversity conservation, but one of the things that she's working on, through Heritage Teas, is, creating packaged products of the teas that we grew up with. And
Mhm.
she said she remembered, um, hearing about Martha Stewart, tea cruises, and basically it was our teas that we grew up with, our grandmothers making, etc., was
Mhm.
being packaged as exotic island teas, and you could experience the island through teas. And she had created this whole product, this whole, tea cruise, that people were going on just based on the teas from the Caribbean that we've just kind of like, oh, well, that's not important. Nobody's going to want to buy that. Nobody's going to want to do that. So that experience comes to mind again, as we were talking about really kind of seeing what are the cultural elements, the cultural biodiversity type elements, because they're both intermingled in that whole tea experience, right? There's an anthropological aspect to that too as well.
Mhm.
um, and seeing how these things can blend together to create income, to create a business.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, Chris, we're coming to the close of our time. Is there anything you would like to say before we wrap up our session? An hour has gone very quickly.
As expected, and we know, especially when
um,
the conversation can go in so many different directions. I guess the main thing
yes.
I'd like our viewers to walk away with is understanding that everybody has a role to play. You don't have to wait on anyone. Yes, the government is there and they're doing initiative, but you can just start by just trying to get more information, and also accessing and reaching out to organizations such as Walker's Reserve, who are doing things currently, or as Cocoa Hill and so forth. And it's in by taking a vested interest in trying to understand and know what you as an individual can do more on, and educate you or your children more on, that we
Yeah.
can start to see that shift. If everybody takes ownership and that responsibility, I really feel like that will help to grow that level of consciousness towards hopefully a more sustainable and regenerative approach.
Yeah. Well, Chris, what do you think your role is, and PCSR Consulting is in this movement? Because it really is a movement.
It is, it is. I mean, I've kind of taken, as you have outlined in the beginning, the focus on the training side, both at the community level, at the corporate level. So that is one aspect that I take it from. But then the second aspect is on the research and documentation, because as you rightly said, it's one thing to talk about these things, because a lot of our culture, our heritage, and our understanding was always passed through word of mouth. But
Yeah.
research and documentation, as what they're doing at UE, for example, is so important. And so I try to look for those type of collaborations that we can push these types of initiatives forward. Because I'm
Yeah.
very passionate. While I need to make a living and I need to feed myself, but the social impact and so forth is also a very big key pillar of my business and what I seek out to do as a
Yeah.
professional.
So for the audience, we've placed in the chat the Chris's LinkedIn link. So if you want to reach out to him, if you have any questions, any one-on-one questions for him, you can feel free to reach out to him on LinkedIn. I think, this conversation, and maybe we should have prefaced the conversation by saying this, while we didn't provide concrete answers, or a framework, a structural framework forward, this conversation was really to whet people's appetite about what that regenerative tourism could look like. I know a lot of persons have focused on the realities. So, what are the impacts, the direct impact of COVID? But we just kind of wanted to open that door to something that I think a lot of people haven't been thinking about in quite that way. And as Chris said, Google it, Google it, check it out, do some research, ask Chris a question, ask Wyatt a question, ask CPRI a question.
Correct.
But it's really like, how do we change? And it does require a paradigm shift, right? And it's not going to be easy. It is going to take multiple steps. But I think if our tourism industry is to survive and that we actually leave something that is of worth to future generations, we have to make that change. Yeah, we have to make that change. Yeah, yeah. Chris, go ahead.
No. And just again, I want to just keep re-emphasizing it's not that that process hasn't started already. We have people on the ground. We have organizations such as WIRRED and CPRI that are doing things. So if you really want to get involved and you really want to understand, there is information and people. And going back to what you were saying about practical tips and steps, because everybody has different roles in it and their kind of scope might be different. When you engage with myself or CPRI and so forth, then we can kind of give you more specifics into maybe how you can actually take a more specific play and role into the whole process,
Yeah, and definitely. So I would like to just wrap up by giving great kudos to the government of Barbados for the steps that they have been taking so far to not only manage COVID, but to move tourism in the new direction. And I mean, it is really, it's amazing, the strides that we are taking and the steps that we are making, and we'll get there. So Chris, thank you so much. You've certainly given us a lot to digest. And to our audience, if you've missed any part of today's session, you can catch it later on our YouTube channel. And remember, it's as easy as click subscribe and watch. And we ask that you join us again on Monday, 5th October for another special edition living room session. And this time we're going to be focusing on World Animal Day. So we look forward to seeing you. Please join us. And remember, you can look at any of our 25 episodes on our YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us. See you then.